Okay, the time is 7 o'clock. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome, everybody. Second item on the agenda is additions or deletions to the agenda. Mr. Bowling, any from staff? Any commissioner have any suggested additions or deletions? Mr. DeBrawl? No. Okay, we'll move forward then with the agenda as presented. Item 3 is approval of the minutes of April 13, 2017. Do we have any motion concerning those minutes? So moved. Okay. Well, Dr. Day, motion to approve. Second. And Mr. Grawl has a second. Do we have any discussion on that motion? All in favor, please signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries unanimously. Next item on the agenda is item 4. It's a public hearing, quasi-judicial matter. I'll go ahead and read the matter into the record. It's a request by Hal and Martha McAdams for a 5-foot side yard setback variance for a pool enclosure on Lot 3, Block 1, Diana Park subdivision, located at 540 61st Avenue. The zoning is RS3, residential, single family up to 3 units per acre. The land use designation is L2, low density 2, up to 6 units per acre. This is quasi-judicial, so I'll begin by asking any commissioners if you've had any ex parte communications, site visits, independent investigations, or if you have any conflicts, or any other matter which may prevent you from deciding this matter fairly based upon the facts and on the evidence and on the law. Anybody have anything they'd like to report? If not, I would ask then anybody who intends to address the board tonight on this matter, please stand and be sworn in by the clerk.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you.
And we'll start with a presentation by the county.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Stan Bowling, Community Development Director. I'll start and then hand this over to John McCoy, who reviewed the application. He'll present this particular variance request. This is the first time the Planning and Zoning Commission will be considering a variance request, so I wanted to give a little bit of background to you all. The variance requests are mostly different from the things that you all tend to see. P&Z tends to look at site plan layouts, subdivision layouts, and just apply existing law, see if the design of a particular project or layout meets our requirements and so forth. You all also look at land development regulation amendments where you're setting new law or looking to set new law. You have some of those items later on. You also look at plan developments where you're essentially setting up setbacks and other types of things for a particular new development. Setbacks are set up and then people actually eventually move into that new neighborhood, new subdivision, new community with the setbacks in place. This particular type of request, a variance request, is for a particular site, but it is for going below a minimum standard, and there has to be very good reasons, and there are strict criteria that have to be met to go below that minimum. And that minimum is set up in a conventional zoning district that has county-wide implications. In this particular case, the RS3 zoning district. So what is done here is asking for a deviation, a variance from a standard that applies throughout the RS3 district, which is located throughout the county. So we're dealing with a minimum that's established for many, many properties in the county. And so it has precedent is a typical type of main concern or primary concern in looking at these cases. There are very strict and narrow criteria, and John will go into that in a moment. I think the key here is to not look at just the property itself, but think about precedent and is the particular property unique. And a typical type of variance situation would be an action that was not caused by the applicant, for instance, a right-of-way acquisition that would change the shape, the size of a parcel, not the action of the applicant. It may warrant then a variance from certain setbacks to make reasonable use of the property. Also, variances have been rare in the past, and one of the reasons for that is our land development regulations a lot of times are set up to kind of anticipate situations that people might get into and to essentially have a code that's countywide for exceptions. And we do that with various things on single-family lots. We have reduced setbacks already built into the code for pools, pool enclosures, small sheds, that type of thing. So we do try to set up the code so that minor things, air conditioning units and pumps and that sort of thing, can go closer than the setbacks to a house. And with respect to single-family zoning, one of the things that we compare, we have the building setbacks to the actual wall of a house or an addition to a house. We treat screening enclosures the same as building setbacks because it has vertical mass, something that you can see. Things that are on ground level or very small in size tend to be the other types of structures that are allowed to come closer. I'd like to go to the PowerPoint now and just kind of go over a little bit of the history of variances. Board of Adjustment was the board that used to hear for many decades variance requests like this. And during the Board of Adjustment years, variances were rare. Had 2 in the last 10 years. By happenstance, the last chairman of the Board of Adjustment is in the audience on another matter, but served faithfully. But we had fewer and fewer variances over the years, and that was because of the way the LDRs have been structured. We started requiring form board surveys back in 1985 to make sure that before someone actually poured a slab for a house, they met the setbacks. You didn't have these really minor sort of variances that were coming in quite often back in the 80s. We also have staff level variances for older structures that were constructed before we had form board survey requirements. So the volume of variances went down from there. But we do have very strict criteria. As you've seen in the staff report, all 8 have to be met in order for variance to be warranted. And because there weren't many variances even applied for or considered, the Board of County Commissioners in 2015 essentially sunsetted the Board of Adjustment and assigned you all, the Planning and Zoning Commission, the role and responsibility and the powers of the Board of Adjustment. So you all are acting as the Board of Adjustment tonight for this particular case, and that's codified in the LDRs. Any variance decision that the Planning and Zoning Commission makes is treated the same as other decisions that you all make. It is appealable to the Board of County Commissioners, and they would have final authority if there is an appeal of a decision. The changes that were made a few years ago to assign you all the responsibility made no changes to the variance criteria. Those have been in place for at least 30 years that I'm aware of. A couple of other things about variances. There are no use variances, so the type of variance that's before you all tonight, a setback variance, that's the typical variance that you would have under this particular process with the more stringent criteria. We don't allow a use that's not allowed in a zoning district to be put into a property that's zoned something else. There's no use variances not allowed. Variances are permanent. They run with the land. And we have specific guidance on non-conforming uses. If you have a non-conforming structure, that cannot be grounds for authorization of a variance for new construction or further construction on a property. And that's all in the code that applies to variances in Chapter 902 of the ordinance. The process for this particular variance and all others is described in the staff report, and I'll hand it over to John McCoy to go through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Stan. John McCoy with the County Planning Department, and I'll pick up at the process. And the process has changed slightly from the Board of Adjustment in that the Planning and Zoning Commission is now the reviewing body. A Board of Adjustment was a 5-member body. Planning and Zoning Commission is a 7-member body. And it is based on the same 8 criteria that must be met in order to show that a variance is warranted or approve a variance. It is a public hearing process in that we do notify the adjacent property owners that the variance has been requested. The Planning and Zoning Commission is to take action. From that action, if there's an appeal, it does go before the Board of County Commissioners. The request is for a 5-foot variance to reduce the side yard setback from 15 feet to 10 feet, and that's to screen in an existing pool and an existing deck. So those improvements are existing, and they're looking to enclose those existing improvements. The subject site is located on 61st Avenue, just north of 4th Street. The subject site is just west of 58th Avenue as well, so the subject property, adjacent zoning is RS3, the subject zoning is RS3. As you get to the north, the zoning is RS6. It should be noted that the property to the east is Imagine Schools. So while it's zoned RS3, it is not developed as a single-family subdivision. This is an aerial of the subject site. So on the aerial, you can see the Imagine Schools property to the east. You can see the neighborhood that was developed. It's worth noting that it was platted in the late 50s. There's some large lot residential immediately to the west, and then there's a surrounding subdivision which is zoned RS6, residential single family, up to 6 units per acre. Smaller setbacks, a little smaller lot criteria. The subject site's outlined in yellow. You can see the pool actually in the photo. Excuse the alignment here. This is a plot plan of the subject site. And what I'd like to do here is really talk a little bit about the background and sort of the factual circumstances that led to the request and kind of got us to the point that we're at. I'll just sort of walk you through this plot plan. The lot's 100 feet wide by over 130 feet deep. This is the home that's shown on the survey, and it's a little over 10 feet from the north property line, as is the existing pool deck, a little over 10 feet. And it's 35 feet from the south property line. So the owner built this prior to 1985, and in doing so, the 10-foot side yard setbacks were in force and effect at that time with the zoning that was in place at that time. So the owner chose to justify the home to the north to save trees that existed on the southern portion of the lot. And that met the code at the time. It also has a 20-foot front yard setback, which met the code at the time. So came in, got a permit, was approved, went through the proper process, went through the proper procedure. After the setbacks changed in 1985, the applicant came in for a pool permit. The pool is set back at 15 feet or greater, but it meets the 15-foot setback. The deck is allowed to encroach in the side yard setback up to 5 feet from the adjacent property line. So it came in, was reviewed, properly permitted, properly constructed. So you've got a home that met the criteria, a pool and a deck that meet the criteria. All were properly reviewed, properly permitted. Nothing was done improperly. All the proper permits, as best we can tell, all the proper procedures were followed as far as we can tell in building the home and building the deck. So all that was complied with. So the zoning changed, and now there's a 15-foot side yard setback, and that happened between the time that the home was built and the pool deck was built. In zoning terms, what that constitutes is a legally established nonconformity. The applicant did everything correctly. Zoning changes, now becomes nonconforming. So we have what's termed a legally established nonconformity. As Stan said, there's provisions in the code that deal with that, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So that sort of sets the history and the context of how we got where we got, that the home is 5 feet closer than it should be at this present point, or than the present zoning allows. This is a photo of the applicant's house. And let me just go back to the previous plot plan. This photo is taken from standing in the backyard looking forward. So it's looking towards the road. So this is looking towards the road, back of the home, edge of the pool deck, neighboring house to the north. So this helps illustrate the conditions and where the enclosure would end up. If it meets the setback, it's going to be right, and I think I said in the center of the window, but it'll actually be at the edge of the window coming down the deck. So I need to correct that in the item, but the edge of the window coming down the edge of the deck, if it were to meet the 15, or edge of the pool, if it were to meet the 15-foot side yard setback. The 10-foot would essentially be in line with the house coming down the edge of the deck. So included this photo to illustrate how those things would line up. I want to move forward, and I want to go through the 8 criteria. What I'd like to do is really just summarize staff's position on each. It's not go into too much detail. A lot of the detail is in the staff report. And the first one deals with a special condition. And Stan, in sort of the introduction, talked about right-of-way acquisition as one. In looking back through the records, and this is the first variance I've ever handled, so in the context of my history with the county and the infrequency of variances, that gives you an idea about the frequency. We did have one in 2007, which was granted. And in that particular instance, in looking back, what had occurred is it was an oceanfront property in the North Barrier Island. It had lost a significant amount of actual land, property, during the storms in 2004, 2005, which was the special circumstance for, or special condition that the variance was based on. In this particular instance, we have a legally established nonconformity, which doesn't constitute a special condition. So staff has indicated, again, in our staff report, that this is one of the criterion that is not met. The next criterions, actions by the applicant. Now, all the actions that the applicant's taken have been proper. So this criterion doesn't necessarily come into play from that perspective. Variances do run with the land, so if a variance were granted, it would be potentially a perpetual encroachment that would be allowed. So the actions of the applicant have been proper in this particular instance, and that criterion is met. Special privilege, and again, this would amount to a special privilege in that there are many properties throughout the county that are zoned R3 that would have a 10-foot side yard setback applied, excuse me, a 15-foot side yard setback applied to them. And in this particular instance, to apply a 10-foot would be a special privilege, and that all others would need to meet that 15-foot side yard setback. As far as unnecessary hardship, in staff's review, this doesn't necessarily rise to the level of an unnecessary hardship. It's not the applicant's preferred location. It's not the desired location. The applicants indicated that certainly that they think the other location would work better, but staff doesn't believe it rises to the level of unnecessary hardship. So in our opinion, this criterion is not met. As far as the minimum variance necessary, staff believes that a screen enclosure could be built to meet the 15-foot setback, and thus this is not the minimum variance needed. As far as the purpose and intent for compliance, the R3 zoning district was set up generally for larger lots. For lots, the minimum width is 80 feet. The minimum area is 12,000 square feet. So it's set up with those types of lots in mind. This lot exceeds those size criteria. It's 100 feet in frontage, has over 130 foot of depth, is over the 1,200 square feet. So the R3 has 15-foot side yard setbacks to allow for greater space between structures on adjacent lots. And that's the purpose and intent. So to grant the variance would not be consistent with that purpose and intent. As far as a detriment to public welfare, the screen enclosure and granting the 10-foot would not constitute a detriment to public welfare. It would just be 5 feet closer to the adjacent property. And as far as reasonable use, the staff believes that the property can be reasonably used, and this is reasonably used. So we feel that that criterion is not met. With that, I'd like to get to 2 land development regulation sections. In Chapter 904, it's a small chapter, and the entire chapter is devoted to nonconformities, nonconforming structures, nonconforming uses, things that are nonconforming, and what you can do, how you can address those nonconformities, when they need to be terminated, when they need to be continued, how they can be either improved, expanded, addressed, maintained, things along those lines. So for additions to nonconforming structures, essentially what the code says is you can do additions to nonconforming structures as long as the additions you're doing conform to the present code and meet the present setbacks. And just to illustrate that point, when we looked at the plot plan, there was 35 feet to the south property line with a 15-foot setback. So you could do a 20-foot addition on the south side, and I realize that's not the applicant's intent, and they actually have a drain field in that area. But that's just to illustrate the point that it's a non-conforming structure. There could be an addition to it that met the code. So from an illustrative purpose, that's one example of where that would come into play, allowing you to do an addition to a non-conforming structure. The other code section I'd like to talk about is 90209. And 90209 is out of the administrative mechanisms, and the subsection 09 deals specifically with variances. And one of the provisions in the variance section is saying that an existing nonconformity should not be used to substantiate or justify a variance in going forwards. So again, these are code provisions, and as Stan alluded to in the presentation, the land development regulations are set up to deal with hopefully almost every eventuality that comes in applying the code and meeting the code. And then variances are really used for those very special and unique circumstances. And that's how we've always reviewed and applied variances here in Indian River County, which is why there have been so few and why we've tried to work with the code to make the code appropriate where it needs to be. With that, I'd like to get to the conclusion. In conclusion, the request does not meet all 8 variance criteria, does not meet the nonconformity section of 904.05 parentheses 2, and doesn't meet the prohibition against using nonconformities as grounds for a variance. Therefore, staff recommends that the Planning and Zoning Commission not grant the variance request. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Does any commissioner have any questions or comments for staff? I do have one. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I do have one question, one quick question. Did you ever hear from the adjoining property owner, the neighbor to that side of the property?
We have not. I did meet one or two of them when I was out on the site.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
I have not. I did meet one or two when I was out on the site, but I have not heard from them from the notice. And I know the applicant's been in contact with them as well.
Okay, and you did provide them notice of this hearing?
Correct.
And I'm assuming they're not here. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I guess you're assuming the same. Okay, any other questions or comments of staff?
I just have one. John, if the pool enclosure would have been built with the pool, with the 10-foot setback at that time, would it have been legal?
Well, at the time the pool was built, the setbacks had changed. If they built it with the home when it was zoned R1, I believe, it would have been allowed at that time.
Okay.
But by the time the pool was built, the setbacks had already changed to the 15-foot, meaning the edge of the pool needs to be 15 feet from the property line. The decks can be built beyond where screen enclosures can. Screen enclosures are allowed to come within, I believe, 10 feet of a rear property line, but like a deck could go within 5 feet of a rear property line, provided it's not in an easement. So decks can extend beyond where screen enclosures can, even under the current code.
Yes, Mr. Landers.
If, God forbid, something happened to this house,
Oh, yeah, microphone. That's okay, get a little bit closer here.
if something had happened to the house, a hurricane, fire, something like that, God forbid, would the house be allowed to be rebuilt where it is, or is it going to have to conform to the 15-foot setbacks?
There's a provision in the code, if the damage to the property is from a declared disaster, they can rebuild in the original location. If it's destroyed some other way, or of course if it's taken down, the 50% rule could apply with a fire, something like that, that's not a declared disaster. And obviously if they took the structure down to rebuild, they'd have to meet the new setbacks. There are the setbacks that are in place when it gets rebuilt.
The new setbacks
Yes,
as opposed to the original?
that's correct.
If this variance is granted, does that mean that every other RS3 owner that comes in with a similar variance in the future is automatically granted?
I don't know, nothing is automatic, but precedent is something to give great weight to here. I think the justification here, and I mean, I can certainly understand the applicant's viewpoint on their lot, lining it up with the way the house was built, going back to the 1984 regulations, it lines up, looks good, and so forth. However, I think the only thing that you could consider not typical of an RS3 lot is the non-conforming setback. That's the justification. But we know RS3 district goes all over the county, and we know of numerous RS3 lots that have non-conforming setback structures. And so our opinion is that if you granted this because of the existing house setback, you'd be setting a precedent for saying that if I have an RS3 lot with a nonconformity, that gives me grounds for a variance because it was approved 35 years ago. Now I get to continue with 35-year-old rules. So we're concerned about the precedent it would set.
Is there any distinction in the code between nonconformities caused by the owner versus, in this case, the owner didn't do anything to create a nonconformity. Actually, the county
Correct.
kind of did some things which suddenly made the owner's property a nonconformity. Is there any distinction in the code between those two types of nonconformities?
There is not. In the variance criteria, action of the applicant is one of the 8 criteria. But I will point out, and John did in the exchange with Mr. DeBrawl, the decision when the pool was put in, the setbacks applied then. In other words, if they would have done the screen enclosure or planned for a screen enclosure at the time they put the pool in, that the setbacks were in effect. So, it's one of those situations where the additions to the home were done over a course of, actually almost 10 years apart. But no, there's nothing in the code about rezoning. That's actually why we have variances. I mean, we do allow for, if the county were to come in and say, now we're going to change your setbacks, and now on this lot you have 25-foot side yard setbacks, and you were to really impinge upon the buildable area, and that's where you get into the unreasonable use and that sort of thing. But it's very rare to meet all 8 of these criteria.
And the 2 things sort of follow up. One is the code attempts to address that with the expansion of nonconformities clause and indicates where expansions are appropriate and where expansions aren't appropriate. And also with non-conforming lots, the county has a section about a minimum buildable width. So if you have a lot of record that's vacant, you're guaranteed a minimum buildable width of 30 feet regardless of the setbacks that you need at least the minimum lot width to get the 30 feet, 30-foot home on there, but you're guaranteed the 30-foot minimum buildable width.
Question. Why was the zoning changed from RS1 to RS3? Do you know?
Yeah, I think this actually happened to a number of subdivisions in areas where the L1 designation, up to 3 units per acre, in the RS3 district corresponds with that, where there were larger lots and lower densities, and that's why you see the RS3, the changed RS3 here. And you did in a number of subdivisions in the county. R1 was, there wasn't anything between R1, which is now the RS6 district, and really like a 2-acre lot minimum, until another grade was put in there, RS3, back in '85.
So back in '85, the setback was a 10-foot side yard setback.
Correct.
But in the R1 zoning district, was that up to 6 units per acre or only 1 unit per acre?
Yeah, it was not like our RS1. It was the same, actually the same zoning district regulations were copied from the city of Vero Beach,
All right.
which has still, I think they still have R1. Very close to 6 units per acre, but not quite
Gotcha.
back,
Thank you.
back then.
Just to clarify, because it's different in here versus what you said, will it infringe on their window at all?
It doesn't appear as though it will. And I'll go back to that particular slide so we can discuss it. And again, this is more eyeballing than measurement. So I indicated in the staff report it would be centered in their window, and it looks like it'll actually come down the edge of their window from sort of reevaluating it at this point. So if we're to come down the edge of the pool and follow that seam, you could come up potentially right at the edge or just at the edge of the window.
So it'll affect, if they put the screen there, they won't actually be able to walk around the pool and/or exit the pool because the screen will pretty much be like right on the water line.
Correct. It would appear the edge of the enclosure would be right at the water line, so you couldn't do a 360 degrees around the pool, correct?
Question.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Landers.
It's something you were questioning as well. When the house was originally built, the setbacks were 10 foot. Had they built the pool at that point in time, would they be allowed at that point in time to build the screen enclosure where the decking is now on the edge of the house as well?
Yes, if I understand the question correctly, if they built the screen enclosure at the same time, permitted all as sort of one package at the same time, the 10-foot setback would have applied to the enclosure as well as the side of the home, and they would have been able to build it at that time.
But the county changed the setbacks in 1985.
Correct. And I believe that was part of a larger scale rezoning where the county not only changed zoning but adopted new districts. So we essentially got rid of the R1, adopted different districts that were really more specific and suitable for the county. And generally speaking, as you went further west, you got larger lots, and as you went further east, you got smaller, little higher density lots.
John, there was a county-wide, essentially rezoning to new districts back at the very beginning of 1985.
What is the reason that the decking can continue but a screen cannot?
The main reason is just the vertical element and it being visible from adjacent property, so you have this mass in closer proximity to the property line, so that the decking's allowed to encroach further into the setback in our general provisions than are the screen enclosures. Screen enclosures actually need to meet the side yard setbacks, and then they, if I'm remembering the code correctly, can go up to within 10 feet of the rear property line, where in this case the normal setback would be 25 feet from the rear property line.
And if I could add to that, this is an excellent question. Side yard setbacks tend to be the closest that two homes will come to each other, side to side. Rear setbacks, and then front setbacks, and then a street and another front setback. There's the greatest separation is behind a home and in front of the home. Sides is where they come the closest. And so a structure that has a vertical element, you can see over the fence or whatever, like a screen enclosure is treated the same as a wall of a house. Whereas again, deck or something else, an AC unit, something very small, is allowed to encroach into the side yards, but it's many fewer instances of an encroachment into a side setback, since it's the smallest setback anyway on a lot.
So if you had a two-story home and you had a deck, could it also infringe, or only on a one-story, on a ground level?
As Stan was explaining in the beginning, the zoning code tries to anticipate many different circumstances for many different structures. We have specific provisions for balconies, allowing them to go into a setback. We also have a provision for similar type structures like eaves projecting into setbacks, provided they're 7 feet above grade. So there are a couple different specific provisions that could apply that do allow balconies, stairways, fire escapes, things like that to project into a setback a limited amount from the structure.
Any other questions or comments of staff? Are the McAdams here?
Good evening.
Do you have any questions or comments? Well, any questions of staff before you?
No questions. I do have some statements to make pertaining to the information that was sent out pertaining to the items that were addressed.
Okay, would you please state your full name and address for the record, please?
Yes, it's Hal McAdams, 540 61st Avenue, and I'm here with my wife, Martha McAdams. You have to bear with me. Public speaking is not my best virtue. You did ask about contact with the neighbors. I have letters from my neighbors expressing their support of this variance. I'd wish to give them to somebody.
Sorry if I quit.
I'll take it
No,
as chair.
Mark.
Actually, why don't you just pass it right here, and
Okay.
as it's going on, we can take a look.
I'm going to read this to you because it's the only way that I can get my point across. A lot of items were covered tonight, and I'm going to reiterate some of those items in my discussion. Our home was permitted to be built in 1984, and I was the owner-builder of that home. It was in an area that was zoned RS1 with a 10-foot setback on the sides of the property at that time. Because of this, I believe that a grandfathering of the setback for the pool enclosure should be considered. The decision to locate our home on the 10-foot line on the north side of our property was our desire to preserve as many of the old oak trees that are on our home site. Currently, at this time, we have 13 oak trees, including live and laurel oaks, 9 palm trees, and 1 pine tree. 3 of those trees were planted by myself. In 1992, and I wish to bring up some pictures at this time, if I may please, have the, here we go. Yeah.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes, sir. I'm trying.
You've given us a couple of statements, I think 4 or 5. Generally, who are these people? First one, Judith Orszowski.
These are neighbors that are adjacent. They received letters from the county office pertaining to my variance request. I asked them if they had received this letter, and they said so. And I asked them if they had any objections to my variance request, and they indicated no. And I asked them if they would provide me with a letter signed and dated and with their address and contact on it to bring to this meeting tonight, and they did so.
Which one of these people is the person who lives immediately adjacent?
We call her Mrs. O.
Mrs. O.
Mrs. O.
Mrs.
Judith.
Oskakowski.
Okay, I'll pass these down, and in the end, Bill, if you could give them to the clerk, and we'll mark them as exhibit number 1.
Yes, sir.
This first picture is a view from my front porch. Noticing the oaks that are currently there, these are all oaks that were in place when I built the home. This is another view from my porch of the trees in my front yard. These palms in this area here were added by myself, along with the other shrubbery. These are oaks that were in existence when I built my home, further from the porch. This large oak right here is a massive oak tree, live oak, estimated to be well over 100 years old. Oops. Should have rotated that one there.
It just fell over.
There we go. All right, another view of the same group of trees. More trees from my front yard. This is a western exposure on this side of the lot here, and a southern exposure to that side. In 1992, we were permitted for the construction of our pool. It was at that time that we found out that the setbacks had been changed after the completion of our home in 1985. The pool was then relocated to the 15-foot setback from the property line. It was originally going to be at 13 feet from the property line with a 3-foot deck on the north side of the pool to allow access to the pool while still inside a screened enclosure. I had also planned for and completed the inclusion of a concrete footer with steel rebar around the outside of the pool deck with the anticipation of screening the pool as soon as we had paid off the construction of the pool. The pool deck goes from the corner to corner on the back of the house. It was during this time that I found out this screened enclosed pool enclosure that we wanted to build would have to be 15 foot from the property line on the north side of the existing pool. We were a young family then and did not have the $800 available to apply for a variance at that time. On page 4, item 5 of the information that was shared, it states that it is possible to build the enclosure without the requested 5-foot variance. I'm going to argue that point right now. If I may have the desktop again, please. All right, this is another picture similar to what Mr. McCoy had shared with you. At this edge here is the 10-foot area to my property line. 15 feet takes me to the top of the tile on my pool deck. I have discussed with a screen enclosure company, and they say that it is impossible for them to build adjacent the tile or on top of the tile because actually part of that structure would overhang into the water. So I would have to have a clearance of a number of inches back from the tile so that there would not be any destruction to the pool deck. It was during, let's see, the 15-foot setback would actually put the enclosure starting at the pool tile, and I've discussed that. And if I'm allowed to come back from the edge of the pool to make the structure sound, then you should also allow me to place the screen enclosure to the edge of the pool deck to make it uniform. It is illogical to have a pool enclosure that would prevent you from walking completely around the pool for maintenance and for its use. And it would put us at an unreasonable disadvantage in the future if we ever decided to sell our home if the pool enclosure did not go all the way to the edge of the pool deck, but block access from around the pool. We must have the allowance of the 5-foot variance or we will not be able to screen our pool. On page 4, item 6, it states that my 100-foot wide lot can accommodate new structures. I believe Mr. McCoy covered part of this. And that additions, structures and additions, and that conforms to the normal RS3 requirements. My existing backyard, as he stated, supports a septic drain field, and nothing should be built on top of that. The unfit yard to my home outside of my backyard supports a live oak that I estimate, and I indicated to you, well over 100 years of age. Encroaching on that area could possibly damage the root zone of that large oak and could potentially harm the oak. I've shared with you the letters from my neighbors, and I wish for those to be read if possible. This is a reasonable request that should be granted. This variance should be considered upon its merit and circumstances of the individual location. the preservation of as many of the natural growth trees on the home site, and that the original home site was granted permission to build within 10 feet of the property line, and the existing pool deck was permitted to be built at the same distance of 10 feet to the property line. Finally, I ask that you approve this variance.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the commissioners of Mr. McAdams?
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Mrs. McAdams, would you like to say anything?
I would just like to say that our family would really like to be able to have an enclosed pool because of the problems with insects within our county and the outbreak of, with the mosquitoes conditions that we have. And that this is only one of the forms of, because I do have some medical issues, that swimming is the way that I get my exercise. So it's really important to our family. So thank you for your consideration.
Okay, thank you. Any further presentation from the commissioners? Oh, excuse me, from staff. Any commissioners have any other questions or comments directed to either the McAdams or to staff? Yes, Mr. Grohl.
A question for the staff. Has, I understand the variance ordinances as they are, but has the staff, or has it ever been considered by planning and zoning or the county commissioners in the past, whether or not there should be an ordinance that addresses kind of creating a uniform pool enclosure situation off of a non-conforming structure that was previously conforming, if that makes sense. So a house that was built that has a pool deck with it, could there be an exception provided in the ordinances that would allow for there to be a uniform pool enclosure that comes directly or runs directly off the house?
Yeah, you could change the code. You could make RS3 setbacks 10 feet, make it the same as RS6. You could change the lot sizes. I mean, the board could, they could go the other direction. They could make it more stringent. But you're correct. They could, an exception could be crafted that would say if you have a legal nonconformity, that can become the basis for a reduced setback. Staff would not support that. That goes against the whole idea of the nonconformity regulations, which is to allow continuation but not expansion of it, and to eventually, have conforming structures over time. So I think, and the other issue with the screen enclosures, and I understand what you're saying, we see a lot of different arrangements with pool enclosures, and there's thousands of them in the county. You see enclosures some enclosures, especially on PD projects, newer projects, do come very close. In fact, some walls come very close to the ends of some of the pools and the enclosures attached to the walls and so forth. We see a lot of variety. Doors that go to part of the deck that's really like a sidewalk outside of the enclosure. But I mean, we understand the difficulty that the McAdams are facing here of having to kind of retrofit, something that they'd started 30-some years ago, to put it in. But back to your question, could the land development regulations be changed to make, if you've got a nonconformity, you can essentially extend it, or that gives you a special setback for something? It could be crafted, but I think it would go against the purpose and intent of our nonconformity section. So you're right. Variances are not the way to go unless there's something unique for a property. If it brings to light an issue that needs to be changed in the code, that is another issue. That's another avenue to go. I haven't heard a good argument for making a nonconformity. Let's make it permanent, essentially, and let's build on it and make it expanded. I've not heard a good argument, but I'm open.
Stan, aren't the facts of this situation, coupled with the code itself, producing really a result that isn't good for the McAdams and really isn't good for the neighbors or for anybody? I mean, to me, it's going to look kind of weird when you've got a pool enclosure that now it's inside the house instead of, as you said earlier, pool enclosures follow the same setback requirements as the house. And that suggests a uniformity. Obviously, there are differences throughout the community, but as Mr. Groh was talking about, the uniform look may be, well, certainly is an acceptable appearance. If I lived next door to this, I'd be saying, please put it uniform because I don't want some jagged, weird-looking thing there. And the McAdams, it's causing problems for them.
Well, couldn't the same thing be said for an addition to the home itself? Couldn't the same thing be said if I need to add a bedroom or something out the back of the house on that side, instead of a pool enclosure, the pool's not there, I'm going to extend the house, I'm going to extend the line of the house rather than have it come in 5 feet or 10 feet,
Yeah,
whatever.
but in that example, nothing exists in the space you're going to expand into. Today, the pool does exist, and the pool deck exists. So we are dealing with a little bit different situation from the one you just described, in my view anyways. Since the pool is there, now we have to deal with the fact that, okay, we're going to put an enclosure, what would look best for the neighbors, for the owners?
So is it the location of the pool that is part of your reasoning here, or is it the location of the house?
Well, I guess it's the existing facts that I'm starting with. We have a house that was legal when built. We have a pool that was legal when built. Now we're going to add essentially an accessory to that group of improvements. And it would seem to make sense to me that the accessory could be made in a manner consistent with the improvements that already exist. And what we're saying is, well, and to me that would be, along the line of the house, the uniform approach all down that side. I kind of feel like we're being forced away from the natural. If we didn't have all these requirements, we'd look at it and we'd say, well, heck, they want to build it down the side. Nobody cares. I mean, it looks better. Okay. Why not?
Well, that would be an interesting standard to apply.
Well, I understand
countywide. Every lot that comes in, realtor, owner, what setback is my neighbor comfortable with? That's kind of why we have PDs, and people know that they can come in and they've got a certain set of setbacks that they can live with. I think my guess is part of the reasoning here, part of the problem maybe that you're looking at is the difference between the setback for a pool and a pool enclosure. That if we allow a pool to come up to 15 feet, then if we're going to assume that everybody who has a pool must also be able to have an enclosure, must also be able to have, it's absolutely a hardship if you don't, then we should probably change the code to have the screen enclosure, either make the pools set back more or allow screen enclosures to go a certain number of feet so that somebody can walk around the outside of it. So we will never get a situation where we've got someone that, you want at least 5 feet apparently between a screen enclosure and the edge of a pool if it's out there. So that would be something that you probably want to change in the code.
Yeah, and I understand your comments. I think that you're focused on the global county, and I don't blame you, that's your job. I'm more focused on this piece of property, which again doesn't follow the facts of your example right there, because here we have the house that was pre-existing, built legally 5 feet further out. So we have that 5 feet kind of available in this case without really at least offending anything I can think of except the provisions of the code.
But a question for the McAdams. When you built the pool, you knew what the setback was?
No. When we contracted,
Just so they can record it.
okay, I apologize. When we contracted with our pool builder, he did not find out until after the plans had been approved and the changes were made, and he had to dig the pool an additional 2 feet to the south in order to accommodate the 15-foot change, or the 15-foot setback for the pool in 1992. That is when the pool was built. So that is the time that we found out. Until then, I did not know that prior to contracting with the pool builder, we did not know that the codes had changed until we had actually began getting ready for construction.
So you did know that ultimately you might want to put up a,
We had planned for a screen, and not knowing the plans had changed, indicated that we were going to have, instead of a 5-foot area, we were going to have a 3-foot area with the pool 2 feet closer to the north, and that would eliminate the possibility of running into our existing drain field at that time. Well, that changed after we built the pool. We ran into the drain field, and I had to put in a new drain field in my backyard. So that occurred at that point. But it was not until then, until construction was ready to begin, that the changes were noted and told to me.
thank you.
Stan,
Mr. Landers.
staff question. If they wanted to put a fence in their backyard on the side, they would not be able to put a fence on the side at this point in time, would they? Because they'd have to keep it out of the 10-foot? Or could they go into the easement?
A fence is allowed to go up to the property line, provided it's not in an easement. So, and just taking a quick look at their survey, they have a 12-foot easement on their rear property line, and I believe there's a swale there, but there's no easements on their side, so they could go right to the side property
There's no
line.
drainage easement on there? Because it appeared there was a drainage swale.
There is on the rear. There's a 12-foot drainage easement on the rear of the property, and it doesn't appear there's any easements on the side.
There certainly may be essentially a swale form between the elevations of both homes and it sloping down to
Because,
the property. That's what it looked like to me.
Going from my experience, I mean, the pool should have some type of a protection barrier, whether it's screen or a fence,
Yes,
anyways, right now.
correct.
If you look at the photograph that I presented, it shows a temporary construction fence up. I did have a chain link fence across the swale of the back of the property. Over the years, the fence rotted away with the post and collapsed.
Okay.
And I removed that fence, and then at that time, I began this, before I replaced the fence, I wanted to find out if I could put in a screen enclosure to meet the safety requirements of protecting the pool before I put up a second fence.
Okay.
So, as you see, I have a construction fence up, which is a temporary fence until this decision is made.
Because I understand where staff is concerned about the slippery slope as to approving one, then they'll have a rash of applicants coming in for a similar situation, albeit this situation was in effect created by a change in a county rule in 1985, and this house was built in 84, correct? So, I mean, it was made non-conforming by the county, and the staff's concerned about a vertical element with the screen enclosure. You've got a vertical element of the house itself, so I don't know where that sits, but I mean, it was made non-conforming by the county, and so I appreciate the applicants' questions and concerns of what they want to do, but when the pool was built in 92, they were made aware at that point in time there was an issue. So I'm kind of wrestling with this in a lot of different ways.
Well, we're still in the hearing. Is there any other questions?
Yeah, in your analysis, in page 3 of your analysis, the last sentence of that top paragraph reads, "No variance may be granted unless the board finds that the request satisfies all 8 of the following criteria." Does that sentence appear in the LDRs or in the ordinance? I mean, where does that sentence come from?
It's on page 3 of attachment 5.
It's the last sentence. Yeah, just a second. Let us take a quick look for you, and we'll...
If you look at attachment 5, page 3, lower right-hand corner, page 3, go up
Okay,
to
so-
6A.
So it is in that section 902.
The Board of Adjustment shall also find that all of the following facts exist before granting a variance, and it lists the 8 things. Any other questions?
I have 2 quick questions. I don't know if you could answer the first question. How many other RS1s became RS3s?
I was going to ask that, yeah.
Do you want to ask that?
No, that's perfect.
Do you have an idea?
I'm sorry, Bill, what was that question?
How many other RS1s, up to 6 units per acre around there, became RS3s in '85 when you changed the zoning code?
I'm going to guess hundreds of lots.
Okay. And my second question would be, when evaluating the criteria, whose eyes do you look through in evaluating the criteria? In general, or can you take a look at the McAdams when they say it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put, it will be a hardship for me to put a fence or to put a pool enclosure very close to the deck of the pool or edge of the pool?
So from, I guess you're asking the matter of perspective. And
Yes.
Try to make it an objective perspective is essentially what the staff tries to do, is take a neutral viewpoint in going through the criteria and evaluating the criteria from the standpoint, again, and as was mentioned earlier, we're taking an objective countywide look at it as in the broadest sense, as if this decision were applicable to many other properties within the county.
Thank you. That answers my question very well. I mean, just as you would evaluate any other request that comes to you, the same thing.
Have you had to turn a lot of these down? Have you had other, we mentioned a rash of people coming forward after this. Is this something that comes through the office regularly where you have to say no?
We have to say no a lot, or tell people to move things back or change it, just as I think the McAdams experienced when they came in with the pool in '92 and haven't had to move that from what they originally, or their contractor had originally proposed. I mean, I'm aware of a few situations where a pool enclosure had to come very close to the edge of a pool that had been put in before. I don't know how many of them there are out there like this, but there are some.
Sure.
And just sort of to follow up in a different vein, from a nonconformity standpoint, we're often asked by banks or title companies or attorneys to write zoning confirmation letters to establish how the structure became nonconforming, or was it legal, and what its status is usually from a transactional standpoint, a loan standpoint. And that's when we see most of these. It's not so much people coming in to build necessarily, but it's the house or a structure that's in a setback, and somebody looking to understand what the circumstances were. Could it be rebuilt? What's its status via the zoning from a loan or a transaction standpoint? And with the 15-foot rear yard setback that was previously in place, some of the homes that were built prior to '84, we'll see that occasionally where a home is closer to the rear lot than would be allowed today, is one of the more common ones we'll see from some of those older homes.
I have a question for Stan. Given the circumstances of this particular property, my opinion is that it seems very reasonable. You mentioned the weight that precedence carries. Is your concern that if we grant a variance in this particular case and someone comes forward with something similar but different, maybe the neighbors are writing letters that they absolutely don't want a screen put up on the pool, and we decide at that point that a variance shouldn't be granted on the next property, that then we might be held to a standard where why did we grant one in this case and not the following?
That's part of it. First of all, I would say, although it certainly makes a difference in a lot of the types of decisions the Planning and Zoning Commission makes, what the neighbors think in this case is not something that we would weigh in this situation. neighbors change, people move, the house next door could sell before this goes up, whatever. We're looking at the lot itself and how it relates for, the next several decades in terms of the setbacks and so forth. So I think the precedent would be, and staff would pay close attention to how all 8 of these are met in any particular case, and see how narrowly it's drawn, and really how I'm not sure in this particular case how the existing nonconformity is not part of a decision to grant a variance. But yeah, I think the precedent is going to depend on how these 8 conditions are met, if they're met at all.
Question for staff and Bill. Are we certain that this request falls within the definition of a variance? I mean, I don't see the definition. I was quickly looking for it. We're assuming it does based on the way it's been presented to us, but are we? Is it a certainty that this is a variance and therefore is subject to this requirement of 8 different facts that we must find to exist?
Yeah, it's a good question. If the beginning of the section of variances 902.09 lists the types of variances allowed, and a variance from the yard area requirements of any zoning district, and that includes setbacks, where there are unusual and practical difficulties in carrying out these provisions due to an irregular shape of the lot, topography, or other conditions, provided such variation will not seriously impact any adjoining property or the general welfare. So specifically, a variance from a yard area requirement, such as a setback, is a type of variance that's allowed by code.
And yes, I would follow up and agree. A variance, and I'm just reading from the definitions in 901, a variance is a dispensation permitted on an individual parcel's property as a method of alleviating unnecessary hardship by allowing a reasonable use of the building, structure, or property, which, because of unusual or unique circumstances, is denied by the terms of Chapter 911 zoning, Chapter 930 stormwater management and flood management.
Okay.
So I think we're dealing with a variance.
Any other questions from the commissioners? If not, we'll go ahead and anything else from the staff or from the McAdams? Yes, sir.
I would just like to re-emphasize that if we are not granted this variance, we are unable to do this enclosure because of the limitations for the access around our existing pool.
That the spring would actually go over part of the pool.
Well, yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, if you're denied at this level, you still can appeal at the county board.
That's correct.
Commissioners level.
Right, I've been advised
So
of that.
you have one additional appeal that you can make.
I understand they have authority to begin a process to change the code, whereas we don't have that authority.
I understand. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. We'll close the public hearing, or close the quasi-judicial hearing. Commissioners, any comments, discussion? I will discuss. I am totally sympathetic to the McAdams. I think that essentially we're being driven to an illogical conclusion by the existing facts and the requirements of the code. But on the other hand, if we're dealing with a variance, and everybody agrees it's a variance, and the code says we have to meet all of these 8 requirements, and I don't know, 1 through 7, maybe, but 8 I can't get past. 8 is that the property cannot be put to a reasonable use, in a manner which fully complies with the requirements of these development regulations. They've been living in the current situation for 25 years, I think, since 1992. So it can be put to a reasonable use, and I can't get by that requirement. So I'm going to vote against the variance, even though as I say, I'm sympathetic, and I think it's resulting in an illogical conclusion. So there's some discussion. Any other discussion? Would anybody care to make a motion? Somebody has to do something.
I'll get it rolling. I move that we approve staff's recommendations.
Okay, we have a motion by Dr. Day to approve staff's recommendation. Do we have a second to that motion?
Second.
I'm sorry, I heard someone over here first. Okay, Mr. Grahl seconded. Is there any discussion on the motion? All in favor, please signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
2 nays. Mr. Stewart and Ms. Walter. So that motion does pass, what, 4-2? Yes, 4-2. That concludes the item on the agenda. We'll move to the next item. Which is item 4B. Now I'll go ahead and read this into the record. This is also a public hearing. This is a legislative matter. It's consideration of land development regulation amendment to Chapter 926, establishing provision and criteria for reducing landscape requirements for projects in remote agricultural areas. This is a legislative matter. We'll start with a presentation by staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the first of 2 ordinances for you all to make recommendations on tonight. This is dealing with a type of provision that the Board of County Commissioners wanted staff and the Planning and Zoning Commission to look at with respect to certain types of projects in remote agricultural areas. And this is also shown in your backup material with the staff report. And I want to just briefly go over, when we're talking about remote agricultural areas, what we're referring to. This is a map of the entire county. You can see the green line here, basically going north and south, is I-95. State Road 60 going east and west here to get out to 20 Mile Bend and through over to Osceola County. And what's shown here are the 3 agricultural zoning districts in the county regulations. This darker green area that's mostly east of I-95 is our A1. That's our 5-acre agricultural zoning. We still have agricultural zoning both inside the urban service area as well as outside the urban service area. And again, it's in terms of density, it's our highest density agricultural. Again, you have to have at least 5 acres, but it is more often than not, A1 is either close to kind of suburban residential densities or at least 5-acre ranchette development. We also have A1 area around the original town of Fellsmere, 5-acre parcels there, again in the dark green. Then west of I-95, you have this, I guess, sort of teal color that I'm pointing to now, and that's our A2 zoning district, 1 unit per 10 acres, so 10-acre properties. And what we tend to look at here is, and I have labeled here 102nd Avenue. East of there, you tend to have more potential and existing 5, but also 10-acre sort of ranchettes. West of there, you have very large land holdings, agricultural property. And then all the way past the marsh in the western portion of the county, the light green as A3, 1 unit per 20 acres. So when we're talking about remote agricultural areas, we're talking about the A2 and A3 zoning districts, basically west of 102nd Avenue. Recently, the board, as well as the Planning and Zoning Commission, considered a remotely located solar farm generation facility, the Indian River Solar Energy Center, almost 700 acres site, 350 acres of solar panels, and a 1.5-acre substation. It's located in the A2 district 4 miles west of the urban service area. And because it was a special exception use, site plan and landscape ordinance requirements applied. And this is a location map of the 2 Florida Power and Light projects, the remote one over here on the county line with St. Lucie County off of 122nd Avenue. Again, over 4 miles from the closest point of the urban service area. A small portion of the site was and is proposed as a substation located at the northeast corner of the site. As a result, that was considered to be essentially the development area that a perimeter landscape buffer was required around, and that turned out to be 460-foot perimeter with a full landscape buffer proposed. And that full landscape buffer went from ground up. Canopy trees, 13 of those, understory trees, 145 shrubs, 533 small ground cover plants, as well as sods. It was a full kind of complement of plants to cover a full screening as well as ground cover. The board felt, when they looked at this special exception proposal, that a full buffer was not necessary in remote locations, and directed staff to propose a change to the regulations, and that's what's before you all tonight, an ordinance providing for reductions based on certain criteria. And in the proposed ordinance, and this was discussed somewhat at the board meeting, there's a provision that would be established for the community development director to reduce perimeter and non-vehicular open space landscape requirements based on mitigating factors, and those 4 factors are codified. They're basically summarized here. We could look at separation between the project development area and adjacent property, separation to any adjacent residential use, intervening vegetation or features, and also separation from a public road, because not only is there screening of adjacent properties where a single-family home could be built in an agricultural district, but also just the aesthetic, the view by the public of a essentially kind of commercial or industrial component on an agricultural property. The proposed ordinance allows the reductions only in A2 and A3 zoning districts west of 102nd Avenue, where a full landscape buffer may not be needed, because there may not be much likelihood of an adjacent residential ranchette, so to speak. The reductions could involve the number of plants, the type of plants required, or both. So there's flexibility in terms of looking at the location and the type of landscaping. So what that would mean, just as an example that we gave in the staff report, the lower level items, the shrubs, the small ground cover plants, those might be eliminated entirely, and you would have sod and essentially trees to try to grow over a period of time on a remote site. The proposed ordinance, the way this would track if it's approved for an administrative permit use, the Community Development Director's decision would be reported to the Planning and Zoning Commission, and you all would be aware of that, and as the applicant would be as well. So if there was any appeal of the Community Development Director decision, it could be folded into the administrative permit consideration to the P&Z. For special exception use, the decision will be reported to the Planning and Zoning Commission and to the Board of County Commissioners. In the case of the one FP&L solar farm, since the approvals have already been given, if the ordinance is adopted, they could come in and propose something, we would review it. If they wanted to appeal the Community Development Director's decision, that appeal would go to you all and could go ultimately to the Board of County Commissioners. So the Community Development Director is not the last stop if parties can't come to an agreement. Staff's recommendation is that the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend adoption of the proposed ordinance based on the criteria, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions, staff?
One question, Stan. Out on State Road 60, was there a precast concrete permitted use that went in out there 6, 7, 8 years ago?
A temporary use permit was issued for that, for the life of the project, the bridge project down in Stewart. So it was a temporary use. So so these landscape requirements did not apply and do not apply to those.
The criteria for the mitigating factors, including but not limited to B, separation of the project development area from an adjacent residential use. Does that put us in a race to who's first situation?
Well, it could. And I think part of the reason for kind of the westerly locational requirement is that we don't have existing residents out there now. And because the parcels are so large out there in those zoning districts, someone who comes in after one of these uses is built would hopefully not go to the minimum setback like we had to deal with a little earlier, go build 30 feet from that property line. They would go in literally with their eyes open on that. So I think that actually kind of opens up the other part of the discussion. If there were a close residential unit out there, I think staff would be looking for the full complement of a buffer at all levels so that there's complete screening, immediately. But if not, and you just have the canopy trees and maybe understory trees, I think over time they would probably provide good screening. And somebody who came and then built a house later would probably set themselves back, and they would have room to do so.
Any other questions of staff?
Yeah, kind of as a follow-up to that, and in your analysis, you make that point that you require reductions to remote areas where future conflicts with single-family residents are unlikely. You make that point, but looking down the road, if that area is developed, if the roads are developed, and if a large housing development goes in there, will they then be required the full complement of buffering?
Right. We don't have a requirement to buffer conventional residential, like one house on 10 acres out there would not be required to provide their own buffer. If they came in with a new town or a planned development, they would have to put in their own green belt to not only buffer themselves from agricultural, but then not set up a nuisance of having a lot of residential near active agricultural areas. So I think if we had any type of density out there, they would have to actually provide a green belt.
Any other questions?
Stan, could you go through the process, because I didn't know you had a landscape architect degree, as to...
You're right, I don't know that either.
how you would determine which plants you would and which you, just go through the gymnastics on that?
Sure, and again, what we are familiar with is a landscape buffer and the different components literally by height, from ground cover, how much that covers, how much shrub then covers, how much understory tree and then canopy tree, so you get the full complement of complete screening down low, as well as on a large scale landscape, you start to get the canopy trees over time really kind of standing out. So what we would look at is whether or not you needed full screening or not. And if you had intervening natural vegetation, you may have a complete tree line on, a windbreak on an adjacent agricultural property, and there'd be no need to put in complete screening at that point, because that's already in place between the properties. Even though it is on an adjacent property, they have the ability to have their own buffering remain on their property, essentially. So that's how we would look at these different factors and apply whether and how extensive screening would be needed.
Would the buffering be similar to what's been placed just recently in front of Castaway Cove on A1A?
Well, again, it's kind of hard to separate what was already there,
They tore it all out.
Yes, they took it out. Your trees, canopy trees in this setting would probably be about 1 every 40 feet, if that helps with the scale of it, the canopy trees. Understory trees, generally in between a canopy tree. But then when you get down to the shrub count, that's actually where a lot of the cost is in this shrub count and the ground cover, and then the maintenance too. If you're just dealing with sod and a canopy tree, or sod and a couple of groups of understory, the maintenance and installation cost is significantly less. But let me go back. So in kind of a large scale, you're looking out hundreds of feet across agricultural land. You'll notice the oak trees, for instance. If oak trees are put in, you would not notice from that distance shrubs, and certainly not the ground cover from a long distance. One large tree per 40 feet is essentially what you'd be looking at.
Is it similar to what we just dealt with, where if you change it, then it's potentially can be changed for any area?
Right. That's why the criteria are very specific. We're only talking about agricultural zoning that is basically far to the west, and only if there are some of these mitigating factors in play.
But could it be one of the ones that you can see from 60, like that you're driving? Could that apply if it's changed?
Well, what we're what we're looking at is anything with viewable from State Road 60, we would probably either not reduce or not reduce very much whatever would be visible from 60. We would take that into account. That's why these criteria, if it's near a public road, we're going to have perhaps the full buffer, if not most of the full buffer there, because it's an aesthetic from the public view. I think it's going to apply to properties that are remote from 60 and certainly remote from residences, like the first solar farm project.
So, sorry. So can you tell me how, in practice, this would work? Would someone from the county go out and look at the intervening vegetation and just subjectively say, yeah, that looks like enough? Or are there going to be any standards, I guess, that would be put in place to determine what is sufficient intervening vegetation?
Right. We don't have quantitative criteria here. We're relying on first of all, mostly the locational criteria. And then we wouldn't say they were subjective, but they're not quantitative. And looking at so yes, we would do a site inspection, most certainly. And we would look at the potential. If you had, you could have grandfathered in 5-acre, 1-acre tracts in some of these areas. It's potentially out there. We would take that into consideration. If an adjacent property did not have room to set themselves back, and you can build a home on it, we probably wouldn't waive any of it. So these factors, they allow us to be objective, but they're not quantitative. We're not setting up separation distances or opacity, that sort of thing. We're going to have to take it, site by site. I guess the only real consolation there is there aren't too many circumstances we'll have to do this, but it'll be fact intensive.
Let me follow up on that. Excuse me, let me follow up on that just a little bit. One example is in our mining code criteria, where we specifically call out, generally buffering's not required for a sand mine. We realize it's sort of an interim use of property, but when the sand mine facility is located, and I'm going to shoot from the hip here, adjacent to 5 and 10 acre parcels, which are usually used more in a residential circumstance, we then require the buffering even though they may be vacant. So that's a condition or circumstance where we may apply that same thought process in this and looking at, is there a greater likelihood, or is it an 80 or 100 acre tract where it's less likely? So that's one of the other is we generally have a relationship with most of the drainage districts in the county of Sebastian River, St. John's Improvement District, Indian River Farms, and oftentimes they have a wider right-of-way or rights-of-ways, and it's somewhat predictable what's going to occur within those rights-of-ways, and having that physical setback, and then also potentially having the vegetation within that rights-of-way or within those rights-of-ways, so we understand that it's more likely to stay rather than to get cleared for an agricultural purpose. So those are some of the factors, but as Stan indicated, you almost have to know the site and know the circumstances before you start to kind of go down that decision tree.
Yeah, and this LDR amendment is really written for the remote areas like the solar farms with them in mind. And in that case, the sod's gone, the ground cover is gone, the low shrubs are gone, the understory trees, they're gone, and then the only thing is the large canopy trees at 40-foot intervals.
Well, that's something that we would look at, and I think certainly. Well, you probably have sod, just as the cheapest way to maintain the area, probably from erosion control, especially at the edge. Canopy trees, certainly. Shrubs, gone. Ground cover plants, gone. Understory trees, in that location, probably gone too. Probably just be canopy and sod.
And so the maintenance of that, as those trees become established, will be a water truck. That'll be a water truck. I mean, they'll have to be maintained,
yeah,
right?
They'd have to be native for that.
They have to be native.
They'd have to be native, and the code does allow for that alternate irrigation, and we have allowed that, and we would expect. Well, We would also expect and look for how they arranged the land right around those trees so that it wasn't at the peak of something and it was going to dry out, that it actually had kind of a plateau where they're planted so that they can really establish. But in a remote area like that, we would be comfortable with the water truck approach if the actual topography was done correctly, which I think it would be.
Yeah, and so the code also deals with plantings that die
Sir?
and replacement of those plantings?
Yes. And if they die off after a certain amount of time, they actually have to replace it at a larger height, installation height, to account for the growth. You can't just keep putting smaller plants back in.
Any other questions? If not, this is a public hearing matter. We'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Would anybody like to be heard on this legislative matter? If not, we'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, what is your desire?
Make a motion to approve the ordinance.
Mr. Stewart made the motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Ms. Aldrich made the second. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, please signify by aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries unanimously. Brings us to item 4C on the agenda. Again, this is a public hearing matter. I'll go ahead and read it into the record. It's consideration of land development regulations amendment for mixed-use regulations consistent with proposed policy 5.6 provisions for State Road 60, Indian River State College, mixed-use development. Mr. Bowling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this request, and this was mentioned to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the board as they looked at policy 5.6 changes, that this amendment would allow an update of the mixed-use regulations immediately after board adoption of changes to the mixed-use policy 5.6. Obviously, if the board doesn't take final action to adopt it, they would not adopt these regulations, but gives the ability of the board to keep the regulations in sync with the policy 5.6. Policy 5.6 allows for mixed use in residentially designated areas meeting certain criteria, and the actual policy 5.6 amendments that are going through the process and that the Planning and Zoning Commission looked at in January deal with a specific area along State Road 60 next to the Indian River State College campus. And in fact, there are criteria in the policy that are reflected in the code change that's before you all this evening regarding the location of that particular area. You may recall that the area itself is adjacent to, you see the pink and the red here, the State Road 60, 58th Avenue Commercial Industrial Node, the Indian River State College campus, and the 66th Avenue State Road 60 intersection. That this is the area where policy 5.6 changes could be applied if a planned development project comes in. And you also may recall the coordination with the State College. In fact, the policy condition that shared infrastructure that would be required of any project coming in from State Road 60 over to 66th Avenue would have to be in coordination with the State College as well as County Public Works. The policy 5.6 changes were initiated by the board back in November, supported by the Planning and Zoning Commission in January, and supported by the board in March. They're scheduled to go to the final hearing on July 11th, and that's when we would also schedule this particular ordinance change to be essentially scheduled right after the hearing on the land use policy. This change deals with Plan Development Section 915.20. I apologize for the typo. I think in your backup material it needs to be corrected and is already corrected. And that contains all the regulations for mixed use, and we use the wording directly from policy 5.6 changes so that it will coincide. And again, we anticipate adoption. The board will have the chance, if they do adopt 5.6 changes, to immediately thereafter update the appropriate mixed-use regulations in the code. So staff recommends that the P&Z recommend that the board adopt the proposed ordinance consistent with board action on the proposed changes to policy 5.6. Be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Any questions? It appeared to me that they're word for word identical, except maybe a section was section 20 or something, but section 18 in the policy, section 20 in the LDR, but otherwise, I think they're word for word identical, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct. You're right, the numbering is a bit different, but
Okay, any questions of staff? If not, again, this is a public hearing. We'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Would anybody like to be heard? Yes, sir. Please state your name and address for the record.
Good evening. I'm Christopher Marine. My address is 979 Beachland Boulevard. I'm an attorney with Gould Cooksey Fennell, and I represent Vero 12 LLC and the Greenfield Trust. We're the adjacent private property owner to Indian River State College. We've got two representatives of State College here present with us this evening. Don't have much to add. We know this is running in tandem with the land use policy changes, and we looked at it closely too, and it seems to be a mirror image, so we support it. We can answer any questions, but essentially that's our only comments.
Any questions of Mr. Marine? If not, thank you very much.
I will say one more thing. As I listened to that variance hearing, I was becoming more and more pleased that you disbanded my board. Those are tough cases. We struggled with applying that criteria for years, and we struggled. I was on the City Board of Adjustment before that. We actually modified those criteria along the way, because if you apply them very strictly, it's very difficult to ever qualify for relief. It's tough for staff, tough for you to hear the cases. So my hat's off to you, and I'm in retirement now on Board of Adjustment stuff.
I think that's the beauty of them being able to appeal to the County Board of Commissioners, because they have a little more flexibility than we have.
We said that too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure they're putting their appeal together right now.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else like to be heard on this matter? If not, we'll close the public hearing. Commissioners?
Move to approve with staff's recommendations.
Dr. Day made the motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Ms. Waldrop made the second. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor signify by aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries unanimously. That brings us to item 5 on the agenda, Commissioners' Matters. Does any commissioner have any matter they'd like to bring before the commission tonight? If not, Planning Matters, item 6.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, two things. Since your last meeting, the Board of County Commissioners approved the Blue Cypress Solar Farm special exception, consistent with your recommendation, and also approved the commercial lot split LDR change that you all recommended for. Also wanted to let you know that the next scheduled meeting is June 8th, and we do have a special exception project public hearing scheduled for June 8th, so there will be a June 8th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. And that's all I have.
Very good. Next item is Attorney Matters, item 7. Mr. Cabral?
I have none, sir.
Anything else to come before us tonight? If not, thank you all for attending. Meeting adjourned.